When warplanes of the Imperial Navy attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet based in Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the largest conflict the world had ever known, Japan had already been at war for more than a decade. In fact, since Emperor Hirohito, whose reign was officially entitled Showa, or Enlightened Peace, had ascended to the throne, there had been little peace for the island nation. For more than half a century, Hirohito had been portrayed as a puppet of the military, uninvolved in the war effort and not responsible for things that were done in his name. But new evidence, including recently declassified documents and newly discovered diaries of those closest to the emperor, suggest that he may have been far better informed and more active than previously believed. In fact, some experts now say that the struggle in the Pacific might well have been Hirohito's war.
He was the only one who was continuously there in power during a decade when the turnover rate among prime ministers is enormous. I mean, one after another come and go, but he stays and gains experience. But the process whereby he becomes a real war leader is gradual.
I find Hirohito is a very cautious and a very conservative man. I don't believe that Hirohito pushed for war. On the other hand, he never made any attempt to stop it.
It was the emperor's army. And this is the thing we should not lose sight of. Every Japanese soldier thought he was fighting for the emperor.
The events that led Hirohito and Japan into World War II began many decades earlier. Hirohito was born at the dawn of the new century on April 29, 1901, the 124th emperor in the imperial line. His subjects believed he was the son of heaven and worshipped him as a god. He was educated in traditional disciplines as well as the more practical pursuits of mathematics, the sciences, and military strategy. To broaden his horizons, the 20-year-old prince was sent on an extended tour of Europe in the spring and summer of 1921, the first Japanese emperor to set foot outside of Japan. Shortly after returning from Europe, Hirohito was appointed Prince Regent due to the failing mental and physical health of his father, the Emperor Yoshihito, and was forced to take on many of the responsibilities and burdens of rule. With the death of Yoshihito in 1926, Hirohito became the emperor. He was just 25 years old. He had been emperor less than 5 years when Japanese troops stationed in Manchuria attempted to expand Japanese holdings on the continent and force a change in foreign policy. The insurgents bombed Japanese-held rail lines near Mukden. The troops then blamed the attack on the Chinese and used the bombing as pretext for invasion. It was a direct violation of imperial orders.
The emperor was shocked at this, but they talked him out of any real protest, and he went along with it, as he went along with most things in that reign. He watched while the Japanese army fastened its grip on Manchuria, and indeed he sanctioned this every step of the way.
In February of 1932, Japan declared Manchuria to be the independent state Manchukuo, and installed the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, as its leader. The following year, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations when the organization voted not to recognize the puppet state.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
When Japan walked out of the League of Nations, this was a kind of turning point in history. To the eyes of the rest of the world, Japan was an outlaw. To the eyes of the Japanese, they were being persecuted, and they were not going to be beholden to any set of laws or protocols.
On the morning of July 8, 1937, the fighting spread from Manchuria into neighboring China when Japanese troops clashed with Chinese forces at the Marco Polo Bridge. It was a minor skirmish that soon escalated into all-out war. In December, Japanese forces landed north of Shanghai, moved inland, and began their assault on the walled city of Nanking. The city fell just 5 days later. On the first day of occupation, Japanese soldiers killed some 32,000 prisoners of war and civilians. It's estimated that in excess of 200,000 people were slaughtered during the occupation of the city. The rape of Nanking came to symbolize the brutality of the Japanese army. By September of 1941, the fighting in China had ground to a near standstill. More than half of Japan's armed forces were engaged in a deadlocked struggle on the mainland. But the war had stimulated Japan's economy and spurred the growth of its military. In the 10 years since hostilities had broken out in Manchuria, Japan's army had grown from 250,000 soldiers to over 2 million.
The China War makes possible the Japanese decision to attack the Anglo-American bases in Asia and the Pacific, because without the war in China, Japan would not have been able to build up the military equipment and the armed forces to dare such a campaign.
International oil embargoes had left Japan's navy with only 18 months' worth of fuel in reserve. Japan had to make a decision: yield to Western demands and leave China, or go to war.
The goals of the Japanese were not to defeat the United States or capture America, but to capture the riches of the East Indies, Malaya, and also to take control of all of China. This became even more critical in 1941 when we froze all of their economic assets in the United States, stopped shipping them oil, stopped shipping them tin, stopped shipping them a lot of other material. So we both forced them to go to war to get the East Indies, and at the same time they had to attack us to stop us from interfering with them.
Japan's Prime Minister, Konoe Fumimaro, believed that hostilities with the United States could still be avoided if he could meet personally with President Roosevelt to negotiate a settlement. In October, pro-war factions in the Japanese government, feeling Konoe's stance too deferential toward the West, forced him to resign. Hirohito insisted that War Minister Tojo Hideki succeed Konoe, believing that Tojo, a career soldier, could control the military. Still, Japan continued to talk peace. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was working out the details of a top-secret operation: the attack on Pearl Harbor.
There is no doubt in my mind that the Emperor knew about the plans to attack Pearl Harbor months before the event. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy, he was told of the plans.
To say that he participated in the planning for Pearl Harbor is incorrect, but to say he knew nothing about it is equally incorrect. He was informed, he knew that there were plans to attack Pearl Harbor, and ultimately he would provide imperial sanction for those plans to attack the American fleet in Hawaii.
On November 26th, with utmost secrecy, maintaining strict radio silence, the Japanese strike force set sail for the American base. At a top-secret imperial conference on the 1st of December, Hirohito authorized the attack that would pit the land of the rising sun against the land of the free. Japan had engaged in organized international espionage since the opening of its ports to trade in the middle of the 19th century. By the time war had broken out in Europe in the 1930s, Japan had established a network of spies throughout the world. As war with the United States began to seem inevitable, Japan stepped up its espionage efforts in the Americas. Radio intercept and transmission stations were built and operatives recruited. Though primarily centered at the Japanese embassy in Washington, all Japanese consulates and embassies in the West became centers for espionage activity. By early 1941, the FBI had identified more than 300 suspected Japanese agents in the United States. One place Japanese intelligence proved successful was in Hawaii. In March of 1941, Takeo Yoshikawa, an ensign assigned to the Japanese embassy, arrived in Honolulu. He dressed in flowery Hawaiian shirts and traveled around the islands like a tourist. But he was not a consular employee enjoying a plum assignment. He was the head of Japanese intelligence in Hawaii, and his mission was to report on the activity of the American fleet.
Once he took one of his girlfriends on a charter airplane ride over Pearl Harbor. And all the time he portrayed himself as a dissolute, rather lazy and shiftless consular employee. In fact, he was very cunning, and he was very observant. For instance, he is the person credited with noting the American air patrols did not go to the north, which of course is where the Japanese would approach from.
Yoshikawa appeared so innocuous that his co-workers at the Japanese consulate never suspected he was a spy. He was so thorough that it's been said that the Japanese pilots who took part in the attack knew the layout of Pearl Harbor better than most of the men who were stationed there. Yoshikawa's efforts came to a terrible culmination on the morning of December 7th, 1941. The 182 planes of the first wave struck Pearl Harbor at 7:53 a.m. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese had dealt a crippling blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. 21 vessels were sunk or heavily damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. Japan had bought itself time to seize the resource-rich islands of the Pacific. But it had also gained an enemy with an industrial might and a will to fight which few in Japan understood. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese war machine recorded a phenomenal string of victories that expanded its empire across the Asian continent and the South Pacific. Throughout the war, Hirohito received detailed intelligence reports from both the Army and the Navy, sometimes as often as twice a day. In many cases, he was better informed than his military advisors.
He was the only one who was appraised in detail of the losses, ship losses, human casualties of both the Army and the Navy. He has 5 naval aides-de-camp serving around the clock. He has 3 Army aides-de-camp serving around the clock. And during the China War and into the Asia-Pacific War, he receives battle reports and is knowledgeable and following events and choosing when to make an intervention and when not to make an intervention.
At the same time, Hirohito became more active in imperial conferences. Though he refrained from giving orders, he often made recommendations or asked pointed questions of his military advisors. A prime example of Hirohito's involvement can be found during the Battle of the Philippines from the diary of a member of the imperial court. As the Japanese advance slowed in the spring of 1942, Hirohito wondered if victory could not be assured with the commitment of more troops.
You have Hirohito asking Chief of Staff General Sugiyama, shouldn't we send more soldiers to the Philippines as reinforcements. And Sugiyama says, no, it's not necessary. Well, the following week, Hirohito raises the same question. And Sugiyama says, no, it's really not a problem of numbers, it's a problem of the rugged terrain. And numbers won't matter. Well, 3 weeks later, the emperor again says to him, shouldn't we send some reinforcements? And Sugiyama says, no. So, you have this whole dilemma of Hirohito. How much authority and power does he have versus how much influence does he have?
Though his cabinet continued to restrict his power, Hirohito persisted in pushing its limits. In April of 1942, he overruled his military advisors following the Doolittle raid. On the 18th, 16 carrier-based American B-25s under the command of James Doolittle struck 5 Japanese cities, including the capital, Tokyo. Japan had been at war for more than a decade, but its homeland had been untouched by foreign aggression until the Doolittle raid. 8 American airmen were captured when their planes went down in occupied territory. They were taken to Tokyo, where they were sentenced to death. Contrary to the wishes of the Army General Staff, Hirohito intervened and commuted the sentences of 5 of the prisoners. It's unclear why the emperor interceded or why he allowed 3 of the Americans to be executed in violation of international treaties concerning the treatment of prisoners of war. Since the beginning of the fighting in 1931, Japan's treatment of prisoners had not conformed to international standards. In more than 14 years of warfare in Manchuria and China, the Japanese took over 100,000 prisoners. Yet at the war's end in 1945, Japan claimed to have only 56 Chinese in captivity. In the Pacific, the treatment of POWs was inhumane and brutal.
Of the Allied prisoners held by the Japanese, almost 40% died in captivity, 1% died in Nazi captivity. And in some Japanese prison camps, the death rate was 50% or over.
Perhaps nothing illustrates the disregard for international conventions for the treatment of prisoners of war more vividly than this top-secret imperial order. Commanders of Japanese POW camps were ordered to execute all prisoners of war, military and civilian, should they feel their prison camps might fall into enemy hands.
This document was issued by the Vice Minister of War. The Minister of War was, to my knowledge, the only cabinet minister who had regular private meetings with Hirohito. So this execution policy had to be known and approved by Hirohito.
In May of 1942, the Imperial Navy showed its first signs of weakness. It was turned back when the American fleet inflicted significant damage on it in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Just a month later, the Japanese fleet suffered its first major defeat, losing 4 aircraft carriers, 3 destroyers, and a heavy cruiser in the Battle of Midway. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's losses were kept secret. The tide of the war was turning, but the Emperor kept pressing his dwindling forces to take the offensive. On August 7, 1942, American Marines landed on the island of Guadalcanal. In the coming months, Hirohito urged his naval leaders to hold the island. At the end of December, after more than 5 months of fighting, the Japanese chiefs of staff reported to Hirohito that they were canceling plans to retake Guadalcanal.
When Guadalcanal was lost, he immediately jumped ahead and said, we have to strengthen in New Guinea and go on the offensive there. So he kept urging his army to stay on the offensive, don't lose the initiative. And of course, he refuses to accept defeat. And that is a consistent feature of his war leadership.
Throughout 1943 and the first half of 44, the Allies advanced and decimated the Japanese Navy. The Allies' bloody progress had left the Japanese with just 9 aircraft carriers and fewer than 50 other warships with which to defend the Marianas, a chain of islands less than 1,500 miles from Japan. On the 15th of June, 1944, U.S. Marines landed on the largest of the islands, Saipan. After 3 weeks of bitter fighting, the Japanese garrison of nearly 29,000 men was virtually wiped out. The airfields of Saipan put Japanese cities within range of American heavy bombers.
The fall of Saipan signals a very desperate stage in the war. Hirohito knows that the Americans are now going to bring the war home, and that no longer will it be possible to pretend to the Japanese people that the war is going well. It is not.
Following the fall of Saipan, Tojo, the man Hirohito chose as his wartime prime minister, was forced to step down.
Hirohito lets Tojo go, but he issues a message to Tojo praising him for his work. Of course, in a short while, it's general knowledge among those who are groping for ways to end the war that Tojo will be the scapegoat. He's known in the West, he's the counterpart to Hitler, and we will use Tojo to save the emperor.
In November of 1944, American B-29s based in Saipan began bombing raids on Japanese cities. The horrors of war had come to the home islands. Still, the war marched on and the Allies closed in. On February 19th, 1945, U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima, just 600 miles from Tokyo. In 5 weeks of brutal combat, the U.S. suffered casualties of more than 30% killed, wounded, and missing. But almost all of the 22,000 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima were killed.
Hirohito regarded that as a sort of victory for his side too. This showed the bravery of Japanese soldiers willing to bleed and die to give the leaders time to end the war on terms favorable to them.
The closer the Allies came to the Japanese home islands, the more fiercely the Japanese fought. On April 1st, 1945, the U.S. 10th Army landed on the Japanese island of Okinawa and began what would become the bloodiest campaign of the war in the Pacific. 110,000 Japanese troops were stationed on the island. As late as the first week in May, Hirohito still believed that the battle could be won and radioed encouragement to the 32nd Army.
Even as late as the Battle of Okinawa, the emperor felt that Japan should have one last victory. Why? So he could get good terms at the peace conference.
By the time fighting ended on the 22nd of June, the United States had suffered combat casualties of more than 50,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Japanese deaths, including civilians, exceeded 150,000. In July of 1945, President Harry Truman traveled to Potsdam, Germany, to meet with other Allied leaders to determine Germany's fate. While there, the Allies demanded that Japan surrender unconditionally or be destroyed. The Potsdam Declaration was beamed to Tokyo via American radio. Japan ignored the Allies' demands and instead prepared for invasion.
The war situation becomes increasingly desperate as Hirohito begins to endorse the plans for the final battle on the home islands, and he refuses to accept military reality, and he refuses to break with the hardliners who wish to fight to the bitter finish.
Early in 1945, American planners estimated the number of Japanese troops on the southern island Kyushu to be in the neighborhood of 80,000. Despite a U.S. naval blockade, reinforcements continued to pour in. By June, the number of troops on Kyushu exceeded 250,000. By August, it was more than twice that number. But the principal characteristic of the Japanese defense plan, codenamed Ketsugo, was its reliance on the suicide tactics that were begun in the Philippines just a year before. The U.S. Navy's Signal Intelligence Service had intercepted messages which indicated that the Japanese had as many as 5,000 planes in reserve for kamikaze missions if the Americans invaded Kyushu, with another 5,500 on the main island. These troops were only a portion of the total fighting force on Kyushu.
The Japanese had planned to use women, children, the aged, as well as all of their troops to repel the invasion. The Japanese trained women and children in attacking the landing forces with explosive charges and even with bamboo spears.
Allied casualty estimates for the invasion of Kyushu were from 150 to 200,000 men, more than had died in Europe in the 11 months from the invasion of Normandy to Germany's surrender. Estimates of Japanese losses were in the millions.
The object was never to defeat the Americans. They realized they could not defeat the Americans. But if they could kill, wound, maim enough Americans, in other words, if they could bloody the Americans sufficiently, maybe the Americans would say, all right, price is not worth it anymore, let's negotiate a settlement to this war.
But there would be no negotiations. Hirohito and the Japanese warlords could not have anticipated the power of the weapon that had been tested in the deserts of New Mexico. It was neither ironic nor coincidental that the city of Hiroshima had been previously untouched by Allied bombing raids. The Allies had spared it, as well as Nagasaki, in order to accurately assess the effects of an atomic bomb on an undamaged city. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a lone B-29, the Enola Gay, flew over Hiroshima and let loose a single atomic bomb. The city was destroyed. More than 78,000 people were killed almost immediately. Tens of thousands of others, suffering from radiation burns and poisoning, died slow and painful deaths.
The Supreme War Council is meeting, and word comes in that Hiroshima has been bombed. And they say, well, yeah, so what? And the meeting goes on. There's no impact whatsoever on the military in Japan. But the emperor and his closest advisor are horrified by the bomb.
A situation that had been desperate was suddenly hopeless. The emperor, after years of pushing for one more victory, finally broke with the hardliners and began to pressure his military leaders to end the conflict. But the militarists would not go quietly. On August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. More powerful than the first, it had the force of 21,000 tons of dynamite. Although the hilly terrain of Nagasaki limited the number of casualties, 40,000 people died. Still, the warlords that controlled the Japanese cabinet were determined to fight to the end. Hirohito, who'd spent his entire reign testing the limits of his power, finally broke with the military and demanded that he be heard.
I think the biggest thing that drove the wedge between the military and Hirohito was 2 atomic bombs. Because it comes down to that point, and they're still saying, no, we're not going to surrender. And Hirohito comes in and says, yes, we will surrender.
Hirohito had broached the idea of using radio as a means to communicate the ending of the war to his subjects. On the evening of August 14th, radio technicians came to the Imperial Palace and recorded the Emperor's carefully worded message. A small faction of military zealots stormed the palace early the following morning in an attempt to destroy the recording before it could be broadcast. But loyal palace troops rounded up the conspirators and thwarted the attempted coup. At noon on August 15th, 1945, the Emperor's address was transmitted to the war-weary Japanese populace. Hirohito never used the words surrender or defeat, saying only that the war had not developed to Japan's advantage and that he had decided to effect a settlement of the present situation.
The Japanese people have never heard the voice of the Emperor. He has never been on radio before. So when suddenly, all over Japan, the announcement is made, listen to your radio, message of prime importance, they hear this voice, which they've never heard. And that voice is saying, the war is over.
The great tragedy of Hirohito's surrender speech is that it should have been made in January 1945 instead of August. If the Emperor had bowed to the inevitability, which was quite clear to everyone at that time, the lives of 1 million Japanese would have been saved, not to mention other Chinese, Americans, and others who were fighting them.
Immediately, Japan began preparing for the occupation. The country that once boasted that it had never been invaded was now forced to open its doors to 250,000 foreign troops. Conditioned by years of obedience, deprivation, and denial, the Japanese population was by and large docile and friendly. The occupiers were greeted with smiles and waving of American flags. Many viewed the Americans not as invaders, but as saviors, for until the surrender they believed that they would die defending the homeland. Now their fate and that of their emperor was out of Japanese hands. On August 30th, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, arrived in Japan. 3 days later, he accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri as thousands of U.S. servicemen looked on.
Peace may be restored.
Japan's war, which had lasted 14 long years, was over. Now MacArthur was charged with the monumental task of rebuilding Japan and establishing a democratic government. 77% of Americans believed that Hirohito should be severely punished. The U.S. Senate passed a resolution that called for him to be tried as a war criminal. In addition, other Allied powers thought that Hirohito should bear some of the burden of responsibility for the war. But secretly, it may have already been decided how the emperor would be dealt with.
I think even before the war had ended, MacArthur thought that the emperor would have to be maintained. And MacArthur said that he didn't want to see the emperor debased, that it was through him that he was going to be able to control the country the best.
It's almost a continuation of the notion that whoever is in charge uses the emperor to their best advantage. In that sense, then Douglas MacArthur is really a Japanese shogun, a military overlord who is going to use the emperor as the vehicle to legitimize his occupation and make life easier for him as he rules occupied Japan.
The general and the emperor finally met on the 27th of September 1945. Hirohito, dressed in formal wear, took a car from the Imperial Palace to the U.S. Embassy.
When the emperor appeared and they had their first meetings, MacArthur was quite impressed. Hirohito was very obliging, to put it mildly, and at the time he probably would have abdicated had MacArthur insisted on abdication.
At MacArthur's request, an American photographer was present to record the event.
If you look at the picture, you can definitely see that MacArthur looks like he's in control. Emperor looks somewhat uncomfortable, very erect in formal attire. MacArthur's in an open shirt, khaki, hands in his pockets, and it just looks like the schoolboy coming to meet the master of the school.
The Japanese government immediately banned reproduction of the photograph, but MacArthur's office intervened and the picture was printed in Japanese newspapers 2 days later. To further the Allies' goals of democratic reform, Hirohito publicly renounced his divinity. He then embarked on an extended tour to meet the people who, less than a year earlier, had worshipped him as a god.
At MacArthur's urging, Hirohito goes around the country during the occupation years and tours, and Hirohito in this way tries to salvage as much of his lost imperial mystique as he could.
MacArthur literally dressed the emperor up in new clothes, got rid of his military paraphernalia, put him in a morning suit and a top hat, and sent him around preaching democracy.
Despite Hirohito's cooperation, the world demanded justice for the millions of deaths and years of war it had endured. But would the emperor, in whose name the war had been fought, be held accountable? As Hirohito's travels humanized him in the eyes of his subjects, efforts to prosecute those who had carried out the war in his name continued. More than 6,000 defendants were put on trial for war crimes throughout the Pacific Theater. But the highest-ranking Japanese officials were to be tried in Tokyo at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. MacArthur wanted only former Prime Minister Tojo tried, but the 11 nations participating in the tribunal submitted the names of hundreds of individuals as possible defendants. Robert Donahue, a 30-year-old lawyer from Tennessee, was one of the attorneys attached to the International Prosecution Section.
We took all of the list of war crimes suspects. The State Department had one, the different government departments had inputs. So we took all of those and compiled them into a master list so that we had all of them on one list alphabetically, and then of all those, only 28 were indicted and tried.
Charged with investigating war crimes, the International Prosecution Section, or IPS, was given broad-based powers, with one caveat.
The International Prosecution Section lawyers are not to request any of the personal papers of the emperor. He's to be left out of the picture, and yet he's the most important person during the course of that trial because the charge is conspiring to wage a war of aggression, and the only person who's in power during the whole period of the alleged conspiracy is Hirohito.
If he had been indicted, he would have been tried. If he had been tried, he would have been convicted, in my opinion. If he had been convicted, he would have been hanged. I'm absolutely certain of that. I have no doubts in my mind.
Despite intense international pressure to prosecute Hirohito, MacArthur was steadfast in his defense of the emperor. While no evidence suggests that Hirohito's war record was ever even investigated, in January of 1946, MacArthur sent a telegram to Washington saying that he could find nothing linking Hirohito with war-making policies.
MacArthur believed that if they put the emperor on trial, that they were going to have massive widespread revolt within Japan, perhaps guerrilla operations within the mountains, and he even said in this message that you'll have to send 1 million more troops to Japan in order to keep control, maybe for the next 2-3 generations.
The Tokyo War Crimes trials finally convened on May 3, 1946. 11 justices heard testimony from 419 witnesses. Among the more than 30,000 pages of evidence put into the record was the Japanese order to execute prisoners of war. It was given the exhibit number 2015, but was never presented in open court.
The prosecution never discussed this document and its implications. It was just put into the record without comment, and the only reason I can think of for that is that the instructions to our prosecutors were not to implicate the emperor, not to have the emperor indicted or put on the witness stand. And this document would have led right to the emperor's doorstep.
The proceedings lasted for more than 2.5 years. Of the 28 defendants tried, 7, including former Prime Minister Tojo, were sentenced to death and hanged. 16 others were given life sentences, but within a decade, not a single Japanese war criminal remained in prison. More than 50 years after the end of the Second World War, questions still remain as to the exact nature of Hirohito's role in the war in the Pacific. Just as contentious are the decisions and actions taken by the Allies after the war with regard to Japan and its emperor.
I still have no quarrel with the fact that he was not tried. I think there were a lot of people there dependent for their lives and their peace and their future on not having any further war out there in that part of the country.
The fact that Hirohito wasn't indicted or punished in any way led to a situation where many Japanese could feel for a long time that because the emperor who led the war was never charged or tried for doing anything wrong, then they who had fought loyally, they never did any wrong either.
For decades following the war, many Japanese viewed their war leaders as heroes. In 1978, Tojo and the 6 other Class A war criminals executed as a result of the Tokyo war crimes trials were quietly consecrated in the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. The inscription on the memorial reads, "The 7 Martyrs." Hirohito remained emperor, and even though he had publicly renounced his divinity, many of his subjects continued to view him as the Son of Heaven throughout his life. In 1975, he visited the United States, the first Japanese emperor to do so. Hirohito died on January 7, 1989, and was succeeded to the throne by his son Akihito. But the monarchy Akihito had inherited was much different from the one his father had assumed some 60 years earlier. Hirohito had been the Son of Heaven, a living deity. His son's role would be largely ceremonial. The full extent of the emperor's involvement in the war may never be known. It has been obscured by the passing of more than half a century and the efforts of powerful men on both sides of the Pacific.
It's so hard to look back 50 years later and to say exactly what happened. Because 10 years from now, some new document might surface, or some guy's diary that's going to reveal a lot of things that we don't know now, that will change every perspective that we have of what exactly happened. So I don't think that anything can really be definite.
Another emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, once said, "History is the version of past events that we have decided to agree upon." Perhaps in the case of the Emperor Hirohito, it is a past that we have decided to disagree on.